We're going to continue on with our next speaker, Dr. Josie Lesage. She's our applied ecologist at Botanic Garden. She works to map, conserve, and restore California habitats using ecological theory as a guide. She has a Ph.D. in environmental studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she studied long-term management and change in California's coastal prairies. As the garden's applied ecologist, she's interested in understanding how local ecosystems respond to disturbance and restoration intervention, and in building a community of volunteer scientists to steward our local habitats. So thanks so much, Josie. Take it away.
Denise and I are in the same room, so we're going to have to be careful about not being on voice at the same time. Let me share my slides. Can I get a thumbs up if they're open, Denise? Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. As Denise mentioned, I'm Dr. Josie Lesage. I'm the applied ecologist at the Botanic Garden, and I'm excited to talk to you today about some of the ways that the public can be involved and contribute to post-fire mapping, monitoring, and understanding where restoration should occur. And also a huge thank you and congrats to Carla, who was one of my first mentors that sent me down this path. In addition to Carla, I want to thank everyone who has helped on our community science mapping projects. These were a huge lift and would not have happened without the help of many organizations, many volunteers, and many collaborators at the Botanic Garden and elsewhere. All right. So as you've heard numerous times today, a lot can happen on a landscape after fire. And one of the big things we want to know is whether the landscape is recovering and how it's recovering. So we have this question of, is the landscape converting to a grassland? Is it recovering slowly? Is it bouncing right back? Do we see significant changes that are concerning or not? And the question is really, how do we know? And as scientists, we collect data. So these are some great photos of projects that the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden has done in the past of us going out and collecting data. You can see that we like to get really overloaded with field equipment and then walk out on a trail and find out what's going on post-fire. But fires are getting bigger and bigger, and more acres are burning across California each year. So this is a chart. On the x-axis, we have years starting in 1987 and going to 2021. And on the y-axis, we have the number of acres that are burned each of those years in California by wildfire. And what you can see is that from the late 80s, early 90s up to 2020, we have 2020 was actually, an order of magnitude 10 times as many acres burned as is typical or as was typical in the early 90s. So a huge, huge increase in the amount of area that is going to require post-fire monitoring. And so a question becomes, how could we possibly survey all of that land? And I think one of the key answers is with the help of volunteer scientists. So citizen science or community science, also just thought of as science that is conducted all or in part by people who are not professional scientists. So anyone who wants to contribute to science who doesn't do that as part of their day job, really. You can do that now. There's so many ways to volunteer and to help collect data. And essentially anyone with a smartphone that can take a photo and record a GPS point can collect valuable spatial plant location and photos. And there are now a number of apps that are super helpful for getting these data back out to scientists. So one of those is Inaturalist. And I have become a complete shill for this wonderful, wonderful app and community. Inaturalist is easy to use, it's beginner friendly, it's a quick download. There's a huge community on INAT who do data verification and who will provide really helpful comments. If you take a photo of a plant, they'll let you know, oh, I actually think it's something else because of this feature. It's a wonderful way to learn about plants, bees, birds, anything in your local habitat you can learn about using Inaturalist. And what's really, really cool about it is that all of this data is then available to scientists to use for other purposes. And so there are a number of Inaturalist projects that are specifically tied to post-fire monitoring. Many local agencies and organizations like museums and botanic gardens will make post-fire monitoring projects. I cannot thank Mark enough for showing that they have exactly that for the Evil 25. CNPS, the California Native Plant Society, also has something like this as their Fire Followers program, where they're showing or where they're collecting data about all of the fires in California. So there is a project for each fire scar. And this is something that we have also done at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. So we surveyed in the Thomas and Whittier fire scars using Inaturalist. And for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those findings. So our goals with our fire survey using Inaturalist and another app were to survey fire scars to prioritize which areas might be in need of restoration based on the data we collected. So we were attempting to map invasive species, map rare species, identify areas that were in need of restoration, whether there was erosion occurring, whether there was signs that there were no native species returning to a landscape, or if there were some other signs of environmental damage. Another goal of this project was really to build up and engage a community of volunteer scientists who would be in our backyard and who would be able to help us collect data, and then to test the effectiveness of the data collected by volunteers and by staff, and to get a sense of, are these data interchangeable? And can we just start mobilizing huge swaths of volunteers statewide? As a part of our training for our volunteers, we did surveys in spring and summer of 2020 and 2021. And we had classroom and field trainings where we had folks download the apps, we trained them on how to use the apps, and we did some really basic plant ID guidance. You'll notice that, or if you can think back to what spring 2020 was like, there was this really big thing that happened in March where a pandemic came around. And so we ended up, even though we had across both years almost 300 people signed up, as with any volunteer program, we had some attrition, and we had in total 101 volunteers collect data across both years, with 7 repeat participants from 2020 and 2021. And these volunteers had a range of botanical skill levels. So we had folks who were just starting to realize that there are plants on the landscape and that they had different identities and learning how to ID them, to people who were very familiar with dichotomous keys and could tell you what a grass is on site. And each of these volunteers was assigned a trail to hike and was able to choose whether they wanted to look for 12 or 24 invasive species. Most of our surveying occurred in the Thomas fire scar, and I'm showing a map here. If it helps to see, Santa Barbara is down here, Montecito, and then Ojai. We focused on the Forest Service areas within the Thomas fire scar, and we attempted to hike all maintained and accessible routes for our surveying. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on the area above Santa Barbara in the front country there, because that is our area of largest and most concentrated volunteer contribution. So on to our results. If those of you, or if anyone on this is familiar with Santa Barbara, this is from the Romero Canyon Trail. You can see the obvious burn areas. All right, so our volunteers collectively contributed over 1,400 hours to the project. Training is a huge component of this, and this number is an estimate, but we had roughly almost 1,000 hours contributed through training, and then at least 400 hours contributed through the surveying itself. So a huge amount of time to produce a huge amount of data. So collectively, staff and volunteers collected over 5,000 observations of all of the plants, or many different plants that were occurring in these fire scars. So once again, this is a map of our study region. The lines in blue, orange, and brown are showing routes, and the kind of beigeish color is the fire scar itself. And all of these orange dots represent a point of volunteer plant data that was collected. So volunteers effectively collected data over all of the trails that we sent them to. And zooming in now on Santa Barbara, we're going to look at the invasive species data they collected. So this is now zoomed in to just the long stretch of burn scar above the Santa Barbara front country. And these orange dots represent all species. We encouraged our volunteers to collect data about any plants they were interested in, not just the focal species. And so of these, roughly half were for the focal species. So one thing I think that came out of this project for me was that a lot of people who got out, once they had their INAT app and they were looking at plants, found a lot of plants that they were interested in that weren't necessarily our focal invasive species. In some cases, these might have been misidentifications of a non-weed as a potential weed, but I think in a lot of cases, people just found cool plants and wanted to record them on INAT. If we remove the non-focal invasive species, you can still see that there's a huge amount of data that was added. And so I'm going to just sort of zoom in on a couple little quick case studies. If we break this map down by the species that are present, two quick things. These bright green dots are all Fennel Funiculum vulgare. And this is a fairly large plant, easy to see, and was well represented in the volunteer data, as was tree tobacco in the light blue. And what this indicates to me is that volunteer scientists are very good at identifying large and kind of showy plants when they're on the landscape. Another plant that volunteers were super helpful at identifying and recording location data for was Agaritina adenifora, which is this cute little invasive. It's always a bummer when they're cute. That's been found a few times in Santa Barbara. So this is all records of this plant from herbarium specimens and some spatial data or some GPS point data prior to our project. And if you were to look at this map, you might think, okay, there's a handful of these plants in our local creeks, but maybe it's something that's still at a manageable point and we could go out and remove them from these isolated areas. After we had our data collection period, you'll see that staff and volunteers found huge amounts of this going almost all the way up into these watersheds. And so what this indicates is that this is not actually at a stage where it's manageable. It's probably a bit beyond that point. I also think these are just cool pictures to compare the staff and the volunteer scientist data. So we've got here the same exact plant recorded at two different periods, in March by a community scientist and in April by staff. And the same for this fennel. You can see from this little corrugated metal here, this is the same plant that was seen twice in one season. So staff and community scientists sometimes recorded the same plants, which I think is super cool. This project was also a really unique opportunity to collect data about fire followers. These are plants that appear after a fire and respond dramatically. They'll flush their seed bank, they'll cover a slope, and they only appear after fire typically. And so getting out onto the landscape and identifying where they are is something that can only happen in that short period following fire. So getting out with your phone and collecting data, mobilizing a huge amount of people is a great way to identify where these things are appearing on the landscape, since they're not really going to be present that much after the fire. And then finally, for rare species, we collected a ton of rare species data. So this is known populations already present on the landscape, all these little purple triangles. And between staff and volunteers, we confirmed or added over 200 populations of rare plants, which again, just goes to show how much data can be added. And finally, I'm gonna call out one volunteer in particular, George Williams, who did an amazing job of identifying this rare plant, Monardella hypoleuca. He posted it and I got really excited about it. This is a species that was described in 2015 or subspecies. At that point, only 59 specimen records of this plant existed, or only 59 specimen records exist now. George found over 83 observations. He's still recording them. And I think that's just amazing that one person he's a trail runner who likes to go out, has been able to add so much data about where this species is. And from what I can tell, it seems to really like these sort of burned, rocky, open areas. So collecting data, anybody can do it, and it can be really useful. So I just want to conclude with volunteer scientist data can inform many questions about invasive species arrival and their spread post-fire, where rare species are occurring, where fire followers appear and which fire followers appear in an area, where recovery is slower or faster, and lots more that I'm sure we did not tap very well in this project, but future projects will be able to tap into. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Oh, will this work if I was going to come talk through your mic?
I don't know if everyone can hear you.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay. I'll mute myself while you ask questions.
Oh. Okay, technical issues, since we're in the same room, trying not to reverb on you. Two questions for you from, oh good, thank goodness. From Joanna Tang, she asks, Josie, how do you feel about your volunteer retention rate? Can you elaborate on the cost of training or tips for how to maximize training and retention?
Yeah, so how do I feel about it? I actually feel great about it. I think having roughly a third of all volunteers stick around and collect data is pretty great, especially given the pandemic. In the first year of the surveying work, I was really great about sending updates, and I think that sort of connection to volunteers is really important to retention. So in my first year, I sent almost a monthly update saying, like, hey, this is starting to bloom, or start looking for these weeds. ID tips if you were looking for Centaurea melitensis and Centaurea solstitialis, how to tell them apart. And so I think that, for any volunteer project, there's always going to be a large amount of drop off. And I think one of the things that I think is something to consider is that in the future, if you've got the training materials already prepared, the time investment to train volunteers is going to sort of flatten out over time because you already have the materials. You might be adding or removing a species every year, but the contribution that volunteers can give is going to remain very, very high, right? If folks are still out hiking, they're going to collect a lot of data for you. So we're crunching the numbers right now, and I think for our 2 years of surveying, the time contribution that it took from staff was about the same monetarily. I think it came out to $11,000 for all training, and if you value the volunteer time at about $25,000 or $25 an hour, it was about the same level or the same financial. So basically a 100% return on investment. But I don't have those numbers on me right now, but send an email to me and I'm happy to expand.
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question. You mentioned staff and volunteers logging the same plant. How do you correct for duplicate data points?
That's a great question. So we ended up importing all of the data into ArcGIS and then running some somewhat complicated geoprocessing on them to say, if there are this many dots within a certain area, merge that into one large polygon. Our volunteers, I didn't go into it in this talk, but our volunteers also collected data about how many plants there were and what amount of area it covered in square meters. And so all of those numbers were crunched together to eventually aggregate them into a polygon. So there's a bit of complication there.
Right on. Thanks so much, Josie. Well done.